Hola, hola. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar comienzo a la cuarta sesión del seminario. Voy a comenzar con mi gratitud a la organización, a la APE y a las entidades colaboradoras de estas jornadas. Y bueno, pues es un placer y una oportunidad porque tenemos realmente, es un programa soñado desde luego para un periodista, es un programa soñado y los ponentes son de altísimo nivel y los asuntos que tenemos sobre el tapete pues no pueden ser de más candente actualidad. Para centrar, aunque llevamos toda la jornada aprendiendo y poniéndonos en situación, vamos a abordar los desequilibrios, incertidumbres y Donald Trump. Y lo vamos a hacer en un momento en el que, en el panorama global, las certezas más inconmovibles se volatilizan, se reducen el margen disponible para compartir realidades verificadas. Creo que Dan Smith decía esta mañana: todo es posible, nada es verdad. Entonces, bueno, nos movemos en este marco tan complicado sin renunciar a encontrar las certezas y la verdad, realmente en la parte, por supuesto, a la que nos obliga la ética y la responsabilidad periodística. Esta confusión se ha multiplicado tras la llegada a la Casa Blanca de un Donald Trump desaforado que lanza mensajes incesantes, contradictorios, primarios y desconcertantes. Y podemos añadir los adjetivos que creamos cada uno convenientes. Estamos en el marco de la invasión rusa de Ucrania y el bombardeo de Gaza antes de convertirla en el resort mediterráneo que propone Trump, y nos preguntamos cuáles van a ser las opciones de una Unión Europea obligada a adaptarse a los cambios que Washington registre, y especialmente en la jornada de hoy con un ojo, con un oído puesto en La Haya y en esa cumbre tan importante y que puede ser tan decisiva. Les voy a preguntar a los ponentes qué podemos esperar de la política de exterior y de seguridad de Estados Unidos, cómo influirá la desaparición aparentemente cantada, la estamos viviendo ya y ojalá que transitoria, de un orden internacional basado en reglas, cuál será la respuesta de una Unión Europea abocada a la asunción de responsabilidades que derivan de esta nueva autonomía estratégica, aunque nos la venían reclamando hace lustros, que ha de estrenar, y si la percepción de nuevos riesgos implicará continuar aumentando el gasto en defensa, que ya ha sido cuadruplicado en los últimos 10 años. Me acompañan en la mesa Dan Smith, que ya ha sido ponente en una interesantísima sesión anterior. Para las personas que se puedan incorporar en este momento, es un investigador británico, director del Instituto Internacional de Estocolmo para la investigación sobre la paz. Está especializado en paz y seguridad internacional durante más de 4 décadas dedicadas al estudio de conflictos armados, construcción de paz, control de armas, ética de la intervención, nacionalismo, identidad, género en los conflictos y relación entre cambio climático e inseguridad. O sea, todos los grandes temas que tenemos, como decimos ahora, en la agenda. Dirige esta prestigiosa institución, líder en el análisis de la seguridad global y el desarme. Ha sido profesor a tiempo parcial de paz y conflicto en la Universidad de Manchester y ha ocupado cargos destacados en organizaciones internacionales y de la sociedad civil. Y también ha formado parte del Grupo Asesor de Fondo de Consolidación de la Paz de la ONU. Fue su presidente entre 2010-2011 y tiene pues prestigiosas publicaciones. Y ellos me van a permitir que extracte unos currículums tan intensos que me ocuparían parte de la jornada. También nos acompaña Pascal Bonifaz, es director del Instituto de Relaciones Internacionales y Estratégicas con sede en París, IRIS por sus siglas, director de la revista trimestral Revista Internacional y Estratégica desde 1991 y editor del anuario estratégico L'Année Stratégique desde 1985. ha publicado o editado más de 60 libros sobre relaciones internacionales, disuasión nuclear y desarme, seguridad europea, política internacional francesa, deporte en las relaciones internacionales, porque es multifacético, polifacético, y desarrolló el concepto de geopolítica en el deporte y es miembro de la Comisión Nacional de Ética de la Federación Francesa de Fútbol, caballero francés por sus servicios distinguidos, oficial de la Legión de Honor y caballero de la Orden de las Artes y las Letras. Tiene también, pues, como Dan Smith, multitud de publicaciones convertidas en clásicos, reeditados periódicamente y traducidos a diferentes idiomas, y también tiene su propio canal en YouTube y podcasts semanales, Comprendre le Monde, así como en sus blogs Iris, Mediapart y Personal. Es un lujo y un honor tenerlos aquí, así como contar con la presencia de Carlos Alonso Miranda y Elío, quinto conde de Casa Miranda y diplomático español, con una sólida trayectoria en el servicio exterior. Licenciado en Derecho, ingresó en la carrera diplomática en 1969 y ha desempeñado destacados cargos en representaciones tan importantes como Washington y Argelia. Esta mañana hacíamos referencia al norte de África. En el ámbito ministerial ha sido subdirector general de Naciones Unidas, director general para Iberoamérica y director general para Asuntos de Seguridad y Desarme, entre otros desempeños. En 1991 fue nombrado embajador de España ante la OTAN, cargo que desempeñó hasta 1996, y volvió a retomar en 2008 para asumir nuevamente el puesto de representante permanente hasta febrero de 2012. En un día como hoy, ya hemos hecho referencia a la cumbre de La Haya, y en este momento, en esta encrucijada de la OTAN, es especialmente pertinente e interesante su presencia. En ambas etapas ejerció como embajador ante la Conferencia de Desarme en Ginebra y en Reino Unido, y cuenta en su larga carrera, ha recibido grandes cruces del mérito militar, naval y aeronáutico, con distintivo blanco, entre otras distinciones. En el caso que nos ocupa de la OTAN, en el que estoy haciendo especial hincapié, su presencia coincidió con momentos cruciales en la construcción de la identidad posguerra fría de la Alianza, con España integrándose en los programas de la infraestructura y con un papel relevante en la llegada a la presidencia de la OTAN de un español, Javier Solana. Así que tenemos tres miradas muy interesantes, muy solventes, especialmente solventes y muy complementarias. Y voy a empezar dando la palabra a Dan Smith, y para que intentéis explicarnos esta maraña de equilibrios o desequilibrios, incertidumbres, con ese elemento disruptivo de Donald Trump. Gracias.
See what he does.
Sí. Sí.
With this one?
Sí. Sí. Sí.
Okay. I think to begin to understand this set of questions, which is bothering almost all of us, and when I say all of us, I mean people in so many countries from many different points of view, many of them completely opposed to each other, are asking the same question. What's the deal with Trump? I think the first thing to understand is that Trump this time, Trump 2.0, does not come out of a clear blue sky. We should have known, in fact, I'll say it, I knew And I wrote at length explaining that Trump was not some random result of an oddity in the USA in 2016 that was not to be repeated. Rather, despite the size of Biden, or the scale of Biden's victory in the presidential election in 2020, it was clear that Trump represents something in the USA. And Trumpian, either Trump or a Trumpian candidate, was going to be a very strong candidate in 2024. And we should now be thinking that, if not Trump, nonetheless, a Trumpian candidate will be a very strong contender in 2028. It should not surprise us if we get to 2036 and we find out that for 16 of the previous 20 years by that time, there has been a Trump or a Trump-like president of the USA. I think in part this can be traced to some very big questions. Long-term rise within the USA in disillusion with the American dream. The decline of faith in progress. The loss of faith in the idea that your children would be living in greater prosperity than you did, and you would finish your life in more prosperity than you began it. This dream was beginning to turn sour for many. And if you watch American popular culture, you can see that sourness rising through the past 25 to 30 years. Necessarily, that disillusion with the American dream included a rising disillusion with the international role that went along with the American dream, and the generosity of spirit that in some ways lay behind, or at least was part of what lay behind that international role. There was an increasing sense in the US with deep roots that the Allies were free riders, that the USA was being taken for a ride. And go back to the 1970s, and every year, Senator Mike Mansfield, a Democrat, proposed that US forces in Europe be significantly cut or reduced. The idea that the USA gained in, not just in prestige, but in influence, power, and economic benefit from its international role has become an idea that has been increasingly hard to sustain inside the USA. It's as if they were so taken by Paul Kennedy's book on the breakup of empires that they saw overstretch. They saw the USA paying more for power than it was profiting from it before that really happened. And Trump is the great articulator of all of that disillusion, that sourness. Remember how he talked about the USA in his inaugural address for his first presidency. The image that he painted of a country that was on its last legs, where there was chaos and illegality and crime in the city, and criminals are pouring across the borders from north and south and east and west, and USA is just letting it happen. He was the voice of disillusion. And of course, with the program, very simply summed up like a good advertisement in 4 letters that we all know what they are. And even if they make your stomach turn over now when you see them, you can still see them in your mind. I don't even have to refer to that stupid red cap that he wears all the time. So Trump is distinctive, and he has a style, but he is also representative. And if we forget the degree to which he represents an important stream in American political culture, then we're really missing something in the big picture. That said, I think that what we confront today, I want to boil it down a little, to say one of the things which puzzles us at the moment is an analytical problem as much as anything else, is that there seem to be two Trumps. Right? So one I'm going to describe in quite derisive and dismissive terms, and one much more respectfully. So there's a balance to be found there somewhere. One Trump is a man-child who seems to inhabit a parallel reality. American intelligence says for 22 years that Iran does not have a weapons program, that we are monitoring the situation closely, and that we will report the second we see something different. But in Trump's world, no, he'll go with Israeli intelligence. The Iranian weapons development program was subject to more intense, the technology development program was subject to more intense international scrutiny than any, because of the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. We can be pretty sure there was no weapons there. Now Trump lives in a parallel reality in which the Pentagon is wrong in its assessment of its bombing mission, of the impact of its bombing mission. The Pentagon says this has probably set back the program by months, and they're not sure that the enriched uranium has been destroyed. Trump says, no, it has been. We obliterated the program. The White House dismissed the Pentagon report the second it was out. And I think that this is not the only example where one hears a statement or reads a statement that Donald Trump has made, and you think, what? You know, what is the reality that he's dealing with, or that he thinks he's dealing with? This is the man who said that, you know, he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. Does he really believe it, or does he not believe it? Ask him if he believes it before he was inaugurated, and he will tell you, yes, of course, it's going to happen. Ask him now, maybe he will even deny that he said it. This is a man who thinks that ceasefires can be achieved like that, and that they will hold. In a region about which he takes no advice, but in a region in which half of all ceasefires fail. It's a statistical truth. And of course, this man-child acknowledges no rules that are not in his favor. He doesn't believe in system. He doesn't believe in complex relationships. Listen to how he talks about trade, right? If my country decides to buy more from your country than your country decides to buy from mine, that's wrong. We'll put in tariffs and we'll somehow equalize it. But President Trump, international trade is a world system in which there are lots of interactions, and as long as it runs well and on fair terms, it's win-win for everybody. No, they're making more money from this trade than we are. Well, yes, but the USA is making more money from services. Services are not real. I'm interested in cars and steel and so on. I mean, it's extraordinary, the depths of seeming ignorance or delusion that comes from this voice of disillusion sitting in that position of power. And then there is the second Trump, the Trump who is the effective, pragmatic operator, and who pulls Europe into doing things that many European politicians and analysts and opinion makers have been wanting Europe to do for years. But they won't do it until Trump gives them a good, solid kicking. Trump is the person who succeeds in getting NATO to commit itself to spend more on military spending. He's the one who talks seemingly at random, saying actually spending should go up to 5% of GNP. That gets diplomatically translated into 3.5% on core military functions, 1.5% on cyber, softer infrastructure, more general security. And today, in a summit that was cut short to 2.5 hours because the American president does not like long summit meetings, NATO has agreed to 5%. Allies are committed to 5%. I heard the conversation in this room this morning about the impossibility of more than 2.1%. Well, you know, you've just signed up. President Trump has achieved that. So, what to do about these two Trumps? I think that the first thing is to try to sideline him a bit in your head. The problem with the EU at the moment is that, well, again, being a bit dismissive, it's caught like the rabbit in the headlights. It doesn't know what to do. The EU needs an objective. I don't think that the EU leaders have an objective apart from keeping the USA engaged. I don't know if it would have been so familiar to you, but for a long time, the rather cynical, I think the British and the French shared this view about NATO, but especially it was a British view. The reason to have NATO was to keep the Soviets out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And still, the point is to keep the Americans in. That doesn't seem to me to be enough of an objective in the current geopolitical framework, which we discussed a little bit earlier. I think there needs to be more an objective than that. I think that the EU needs to think longer term, and I think it needs to prepare for what it doesn't want to see, as well as for what it would like to see. In 2020, when Biden was elected, and in 2021, when he was inaugurated, the sigh of relief from European leaders was audible all around the world. Oh, now we're back to normal. And they stopped thinking about what might happen in 2024 and 2025 and beyond. We can't let that happen again. Not being caught like rabbits in the headlights, but just looking at the world as it is, with its uncertainties. What should the EU's direction be? If I take one more minute, I just want to say about the direction of the EU and of European NATO states at the moment. Not to say what I think the big objective should be. I leave it hanging there. It needs discussion. We need to think and talk about it. The best minds should be at work on this. But just about this response of trying to appease Donald Trump by deciding to spend more money. There's a few things to say here. First of all, it won't appease Donald Trump for long. Right? He's not going to love Europe. He just won't. There's an article in yesterday's newspaper, The Guardian in England, which headlines saying something like, "Dear world leaders, don't keep on at Donald Trump. He's going to turn out to be the worst boyfriend you've ever had. Doesn't matter what you do, he's not going to stick with you." Donald Trump is always going to stick with Donald Trump, and at the moment, therefore, with America. Europe comes second. Acknowledge that truth. The second thing is that simply throwing money at a problem won't solve it. So I would like there to be more focus or less focus on how much money is spent and more on how it is to be spent. And when one thinks about how it is to be spent and the inefficiencies of the present, you come to the very, very difficult, tough question for Europeans, the one which in fact broke Britain's commitment to the EU. And that is that by having all of these separate states with their national sovereignty and their separate military enterprises, you have much higher transaction costs. You have 28 times the transaction cost that you actually need to have. There comes a moment where if we are thinking about the defense of Europe, we need to think about what is the political and constitutional shape of Europe and how it is possible to get closer cooperation, coordination and integration in functions where if we could reduce transaction costs, we would get great benefit. We have realized that in other things. We've realized that over climate. We've realized that to a degree over policing. To some degree, we've realized it over health. But we have not realized it yet over the military enterprise. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Dan Smith, por esa descripción inquietante pero muy gráfica de ese Trump bifronte al que tenemos que inventar o llegar a comprender cómo hacerle frente sin darle tanta importancia. Yo también creo que tendremos oportunidad en el coloquio y a lo largo de las otras intervenciones también de estudiar el papel de Putin como espejo y como aliado también de todo lo que está forzando Trump a hacer a la Unión Europea. Creo que esta mañana, Miguel Ángel Aguilar, eras tú el que decías que Trump en realidad también quiere ser Putin y también has dejado sobre la mesa el debate muy interesante que se está soslayando sobre cómo gastar ese aumento de dinero. Así que muchísimas gracias por esta primera intervención tan interesante y le doy la palabra a Pascal Bonifaz. Muchas gracias.
My first participation in an international meeting as an academic was in 1983 in this very place in Toledo. So I'm very happy to be again in Toledo in this wonderful place. And very happy also to see again Carlos Miranda, with whom I work heavily on Euromissile crisis during the 80s for the coordination of the Socialist Party in this time. So I think that we attend to a real strategic revolution. And the world, which has birth just after World War II, is over. And Trump is demolishing this world. This world, set after 1945, was a world based on international law, multilateral institutions, United Nations, and the role of the law against the force. Trump is totally opposed to that, because in his mind, international law is a useless tool to prevent American sovereignty. And in his world, the power is everything, the law is nothing. So in Trump's mind, when you are powerful, you are doing whatever you want. And if you are weak, you are doing whatever you can. And the law is just a protection of the weak against the strong, so it's useless and it's even dangerous. And in his mind, there is no more Western world. I think that we must realize that the Western world, as we have witnessed since 80 years, is over. What was Western world? In 1946, Churchill defined an Iron Curtain from Stettin to Trieste. In 1987, Truman said that America will take the lead of the free world. And in 1949, we have created Atlantic Alliance, and 1 year after, NATO. The core of NATO is Article 5. Regarding Article 5, every country which could be attacked by another one is protected by all the other members of the alliance. Article 5 is really the core of NATO, the core of Atlantic Alliance, but Trump is no longer believing in alliance and no longer believing in Article 5. He has stated in the plan coming to the NATO summit that there is many definitions of Article 5. There's only one. It's solidarity. And since that, European countries were protected by Washington against Russia, against Moscow threat. Moscow could be the capital of USSR, Moscow could be the capital of Russia, but US protection is offered to European countries because they are too weak to protect themselves and they need the protection of an American superpower. In the beginning of the 60s, de Gaulle has proposed to other European countries to be more independent, and all other European countries say no because we fear French imperialism. You want to travel first with a second-class ticket, and we trust America, and we prefer to stay protected by America. After the implosion of Soviet Union, Mitterrand made this kind of proposal again, say we were strong enough to fly by your own role, but everyone wants to keep NATO because we don't know what the future could be, because it was the sole motive to be a European country for USA, and because the unknown was quite fear, and we prefer to stay NATO and to keep NATO. Dan has referred to Mansfield proposal in the 60s. When Senator Mansfield proposed to reduce military American presence in Europe to the other senator, every year the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA come to see the senator and told them, you are not in Europe for European countries. We are in Europe for ourselves, because it's our own interest to be in Europe, because we have an influence. And when you are protected by the other, could be in the schoolyard or any other place, when you protect someone, you have benefit of your protection. And if you are protected, you have to pay the price of the protection. And for many years, the price was a kind of diplomatic influence, political influence, and European countries obey to US in the difficult times. It was impossible for European countries to criticize Vietnam War, for example, except for France, because we had our own nuclear weapons. And it was very difficult to have a different position from US, because if you are protected, you don't oppose your protector. But when Trump 1 came to power, Trump 1 and Trump 2 has nothing to see, because during Trump 1 there is adult in the rooms. There is no more adult in the rooms now. All the people who gather around Trump are designated by himself, have a personal loyalty to Trump and not to American Constitution. And in his mind, in Trump's mind, the real divide is January 6, 2021. If you believe that it was a clear revolt of people protesting against the thief on election, you are on the good side. If you think that there is an assault against American democracy, you are on the wrong side. And even if you are Republican, you will be dismissed. Republican Party is no longer Republican Party. Republican Party is a MAGA party. And from Mike Pence to Liz Cheney, all the Republicans who oppose Trump has been put aside. And so when Trump 1 came to power, he has begun to criticize Europe, to say that Europe is an enemy and not an ally. And remember, in November 2019, Macron said that NATO was brain dead. It was quite right in this time, but Putin has given a new birth to NATO. And due to Ukrainian aggression, so I'm not totally agree with that, what you have said this morning. I think that real war was in 22, not in 14, but it's a matter of discussion. But the real war, a war of aggression, a war with the illegal, with soldiers on the ground, was launched by Russia in 2022, and so therefore they give new attractiveness to NATO, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and all European countries begging US to reinforce their military presence in Europe and expanding their military expenditure for buying weapons in USA. 63% of European acquisition of weapons outside their own national constituency are made in USA. So it's very interesting for USA. And of course, we are stopped to buy gas and oil, mostly to Russia. And so, for example, for Germany, it's a total disaster. Its economic model is over. To buy cheap gas, to export things to US and to China. It's over. So we have non-economic crisis, and we are in a different position regarding USA because they have cheap energy and we have expensive energy. And so the European competitiveness is much less efficient than before. So Putin has done a terrible mistake, thinking that he will be applauded in Kyiv and that every Ukrainian wanted to see him coming. It was true for Crimea. It was false for the Ukraine. In 2014, he has won Crimea and lost Ukraine. And he has not realized that. So NATO has a new birth, but at the same time, it was the beginning of the end for NATO. Because, as Dan has said, there is two opposite strong movements in US, the one which is dedicated to alliance, and the one who thinks that alliance it's a useless obligation and it's better to deal one by one and not with a multilateral body. And NATO is a multilateral body by the fact. And so Trump is hating both United Nations and NATO. For him, it's the same. There is no more allies, rivals, and enemies. And he prefers Putin to Macron and to any other European leaders. And so we were in a case in which we stick to international law. We have condemned Russian aggression to stick to international law. Meanwhile, it's true that we must admit that the respect of international law is much more efficient for Ukraine than for Gaza and for Israel. And so it's an enormous European and Western contradiction. And our moral credit is affected in Global South by this huge contradiction. But we will let set aside. But so, and we witness an American president who wants to annex Greenland, who wants to annex Canada, two founding members of NATO, who state that the European Union has been created to screw up United States, and that the EU is an enemy for US, and want to have a love affair with Putin over European and Ukrainian shoulders. The first meeting to put an end to Ukrainian war was a meeting in Saudi Arabia between Russian and American diplomats. And if you are not at the table, you are at the menu. And so we are taken between rock and hard place, between Putin and Trump, because both of them hate European Union. Putin hates European Union because it's for him it's too liberal organization in which women, homosexual, and minority have rights, which is just impossible for him. But same for Trump, by the fact. And because he reproached to European countries to have obeyed to US in any time and not to have taken a different position from US in any circumstances, and above all, in 2014, when the three European ministers left Ukraine after they reached a deal between the opposition and the government, and the deal was not put into place, and there is the Maidan revolution just after. So Putin hates the European Union. He considers European Union as an enemy. He's right by the fact. But Trump as well. Trump considers that EU, due to trade affairs, due to moral affairs, is the enemy, and he has no allies. He has no rivals. Everybody is on the same level. When he wants to put tariffs, in fact, Japan, European Union is considered on the same level as any other countries. So I think that it's not a nightmare which will get out quickly. It will last at least 4 years. And after 4 years, if J.D. Vance is elected, it will be worse. So it's not Trump. It's a large part of American society, of American leadership, and they see EU as something which is living due to their generous offer. There is no generous offer, but in their mind, they think that we are living lavishly due to their spending, military spending. So if we don't realize that the Western world is over, that we have a new position to make, we will lose heavily because we have a huge Russian threat, we have an important Chinese challenge, and we have also an American challenge. I think that Mark Rutte words which has been taken public by Trump to humiliate, I think, Mark Rutte, saying that Trump is the most important president that everybody wants to please, and he has reached a deal that never has been reached before. I think it's unnecessary to try to please Trump, because he's not. The more we will try to please him, the more he will think that we are weak and that he could push a little more to have more. So it's time to think about European autonomy, because it's not a choice, it's an obligation. There is no more choice. Either we will be trapped between Trump and Putin and between other world, China and other. Either we will fix our own security, our own policy by ourselves, because we have the means to do it. And it will be foolish to increase military expenditure just to buy American weapons. In fact, the deal was 5 against 5. We will go to 5% of military expenditure to be sure that Article 5 will be implemented. But there is no more Article 5. So it's unnecessary to spend so much money just to give him to military American industry, because we have other tools, we have other needs in Europe. And defense, it's also a social balance of spending. We need a health system, we need education system. We need this more than to spend till 5%. Of course, we need to increase our military expenditure because Putin obliged us to do it. But I think we have to fix our military industry, our own European military industry, and to have our own decision, and to stop to deny the reality. And the reality is Trump is not our friend. Trump is a threat. The protector is becoming a predator against our values, against some of our territories, and against our own interests and our economy. So I think what we must realize that and go out of the nightmare, and we must act by ourselves to go once again in direction of the European autonomy, which could be compatible with a new alliance with USA if another president came in 4 years. But we could not depend anymore of the vote of 200,000 electors in Pennsylvania to see who will be the next president.
Muchísimas gracias, Pascal. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por esta descripción muy certera, muy acerada de esos ecos de los mundos de ayer que desaparecen, pero bueno, también es un acicate para construir nuestro propio destino europeo. Y creo que has continuado en los temas que se están poniendo sobre la mesa: cómo gastar el dinero, cómo tener la autonomía, cómo superar esa pinza que tenemos en Europa entre Trump y Putin, y le ha dejado la pelota botando, si me permiten la expresión coloquial, a Carlos Miranda, con ese repaso por el papel de la OTAN a lo largo de su historia, también por el bache que tuvo antes de presagiado por los presidentes demócratas también, y con ese balón de oxígeno que le da la invasión de Ucrania por parte de Putin. Y tú puedes hablar y contarnos lo que creas conveniente, pero creo que el papel de la OTAN en toda esta encrucijada es fundamental. Gracias, Carlos Miranda.
¿Esto funciona? Sí. Pues primero quiero dar las gracias a los que han organizado mi presencia aquí, y entre ellos muy especialmente a Miguel Ángel Aguilar, que me llamó ayer. Miguel Ángel, me has producido el complejo de Modric. Tú sabes que Modric es un jugador fenomenal, y yo me considero fenomenal, aunque a veces juego los partidos mal, pero soy fenomenal. Pero a Modric le pasa como a mí, que está viejo, y entonces le sacan en las segundas partes. Y le sacan en las segundas partes a veces a ver si el equipo mejora y mete algún gol. pero otras veces es porque las cosas van muy bien, que es como lo que pasa ahora, y para que se dé un paseo tranquilo. O sea que te agradezco el complejo de Modric que me has producido hoy. Y estoy aquí encantado con estos dos compañeros de mesa y en los cuales pues, he escuchado atentamente, pero voy a seguir mi curso. Yo creo que, porque aquí estamos hablando de las incertidumbres del mundo, yo recuerdo que el mundo siempre ha sido incierto. Yo no recuerdo un mundo seguro, ni durante la Guerra Fría, ni después de la Guerra Fría. Yo creo que hay un evento que lo voy a mencionar un poco anecdóticamente, pero que no se menciona nunca, y es el golpe de Estado contra Gorbachov. Porque yo creo que el golpe de Estado contra Gorbachov cambió mucho el final de la Guerra Fría, porque el final de la Guerra Fría con Gorbachov era lo que en inglés se llama un soft landing. Y con el golpe de Estado, durante 3 días se erizaron los pelos, por lo menos los míos, porque parecía que la Unión Soviética iba a volver atrás, iba a ser la Unión Soviética dura. Y si menciono esto es porque yo creo que ese evento desgraciado produjo muchas desconfianzas hacia Rusia en el mundo occidental. Y que no todo se explica con eso, pero que es parte de la explicación de las cosas y de los tratos y de las relaciones o no relaciones que hemos tenido con el final de la Unión Soviética y sobre todo con la explosión de la Unión Soviética, pero también de Rusia. Y todo eso conlleva problemas. Y problemas significa también nuevas incertidumbres. De alguna manera, yo creo que estamos en una situación en la que las incertidumbres, pues por un lado son las mismas, para Europa sigue siendo Rusia, para nosotros, luego pequeña referencia, es más el sur, evidentemente, pero es la misma. Pero luego hay factores que cambian esto. Factores a veces que yo no me voy a meter en ellos, que son tipo ecológicos, el cambio climático, etcétera, pero más ceñidos al aspecto de la seguridad y de la relación transatlántica. Yo creo que mis dos compañeros de mesa lo han señalado bastante bien. Trump es una máquina de incertidumbre. Dicho esto, pues la incertidumbre no significa que todo va en la mala dirección. A veces va en direcciones que nos parecen bien, pero que claro, dado el individuo, pues nos deja siempre un remusguillo. Por ejemplo, cuando lean ustedes hoy el comunicado de la OTAN, pues verán que es un comunicado, yo diría, muy clásico. Tiene una gran virtud, que tiene solo 5 puntos, y me parece, no sé si es una página o página un poco más. Por fin un comunicado que se puede leer rápidamente. Pero, por otra parte, pues reafirma el artículo 5, reafirma la relación transatlántica. Es verdad, habla del 5%, pero ahí yo voy a recoger lo que ha dicho Dan antes. Aquí el problema probablemente de ese 5% no es tanto el 5% como cómo se gasta ese 5%, cómo se llega a ese 5%, si es que se llega a ese 5%. Porque ese 5% es en un plazo de 10 años. En 10 años pueden ocurrir muchas cosas, malas, pero buenas también. Entonces yo creo que es verdad que esto ha venido impuesto en gran medida por Trump y por Estados Unidos, pero los europeos también tendrían que darse cuenta que los americanos llevan, yo diría que 20 años, diciendo a los europeos, en el gasto de defensa por la defensa de Europa, aquí hay una injusticia. Yo gasto el 75% y ustedes europeos el 25%. Esto no puede seguir. Y a los europeos eso les ha entrado por un oído y les ha salido por el otro durante décadas. Yo he dicho 20 años. Debe ser aproximadamente eso. Y ha hecho falta, y esto es lo triste, ha hecho falta que venga un señor que todos consideramos que es bastante maleducado, que es un chuleta, que es no sé qué, para que los europeos, como decimos en español, se pongan las pilas. Porque la solución para mantener una buena relación transatlántica. Yo no la quiero suprimir. Yo quiero que se mantenga la alianza con Estados Unidos, pero sí es verdad que para mantener esa alianza y que Estados Unidos hace falta que sea, llamémoslo, más equilibrada. Y el equilibrio consiste evidentemente en que los europeos pues, paguen más de su parte. Dice Pascal, y con razón, ¿para comprar material americano? Bueno, sí, pero los europeos tienen también que poner su industria de armamento. No sé, desde el final de la Guerra Fría, ¿qué hemos hecho los europeos? Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait? On n'a rien fait. Alors maintenant, on ne peut pas pleurer. No es posible. Es decir, yo creo que hay que empezar a poner las piedras. Y como ocurre cuando empiezas a poner las piedras de un muro, pues los primeros centímetros pues parece que no es nada. Y luego llegas al metro y a los 2 metros y a los 3 metros. Entonces, Europa, pues bien, pues si Europa quiere ser algo, tiene que ser una Europa federal. ¿Cuándo va a ser Europa una Europa federal? A los británicos puede que no les guste, pero a los continentales sí. Pero, ¿cuándo? ¿Cómo? Hablamos de defensa europea. Bueno, yo quisiera que el pilar europeo de la alianza fuera un auténtico pilar europeo, que pudiera funcionar en el marco de la alianza o fuera del marco de la alianza, si necesario. Yo creo que se puede hacer, pero hay que ponerse a ello. Hay que ponerse a ello. Entonces, creo que los europeos tienen que hacer más por su defensa europea. Y voy a lanzar otro tema, aprovechando que está Pascal, que sabe mucho más que yo sobre este tema, la disuasión nuclear. ¿Una defensa europea es posible sin una disuasión nuclear? A mi juicio no. Tenemos la francesa. Bien, pero como dicen los franceses, hay un solo dedo en el gatillo, que por ahora es el francés. Yo prefiero eso a ningún dedo en ningún gatillo nuclear. Pero si somos un día una federación europea, habrá que enfocar ese problema de otra manera. Porque yo lo que quisiera es un presidente en Bruselas que tenga como el americano o como el ruso o como el chino un botoncito al lado por si hace falta usarlo. O no usarlo, sino más bien para amenazar con usarlo, hacer disuasión. Y en eso, pues Francia será clave para ello. Hoy por hoy, imagino, por ejemplo, pasos intermedios. Uno, en que Francia diga, como lo dice ya en cierta manera, mi disuasión nuclear estoy dispuesta a ponerla a disposición de los demás socios de la Unión Europea. Magnífico. Yo si fuera francés, no lo soy, Pascal sí lo es, le diría a los demás a un momento dado, sí, pero para poder hacer eso, en vez de 4 submarinos necesito 7. Y para poder hacer eso necesito más aviones. ¿Lo voy a pagar yo, Francia? ¿O van ustedes a poner algo? Claro, esto es incómodo para Francia, porque aunque tenga el dedo en el gatillo, si los demás pagamos algo, pues diremos lo que dicen todos los que pagan. Oye, que yo pago. Es muy complicado, Pascal. Y yo sé que tú tienes una mente y nos dirás algo ahora, estoy convencido. De ir salvando estos problemas. Pero lo que quiero decir es que yo estoy harto de que los europeos lloren. Si no nos gusta Trump, pues pongamos algo, hagamos nosotros algo y tengamos en cuenta pues, que tenemos ahora unos Estados Unidos pues, menos favorables. Yo estoy de acuerdo con el análisis de que Trump no nos quiere, pero bueno, también nos dirán algunos, pero Trump dentro de 4 años o dentro de 3, ya han pasado casi 1, no estará. Vamos a ver el siguiente. No digo que vaya a ser totalmente distinto. Veremos si es otro republicano, veremos si es un demócrata, pero todo eso son incertidumbres. Y la forma que los europeos tienen para luchar contra esa incertidumbre es su defensa europea. Ir hacia una Unión Europea que sea una federación. Quería también decir 2 cositas más. Yo veo, como todos nosotros, la televisión y vemos todo lo que ocurre en Ucrania y en otros sitios. Y yo creo que la percepción que supongo que puede tener, y no digo que se refleje inmediatamente, pero es la siguiente. Antes las guerras, aparte que estaban lejos y esta sigue siendo lejos, pero eran otras guerras. Ahora las guerras de ahora resulta que ¿qué vemos? Edificios de viviendas destruidas por un misil. Y si no es por un misil, por un dron. Los Pirineos ya no protegen. A ver si los españoles empiezan a darse cuenta que los Pirineos no son un valladar contra cosas que ocurren en Europa. Porque el misil puede llegar en cualquier momento, si hay una guerra, claro, o si estamos involucrados. Y yo creo que además tenemos que mostrar solidaridad con los demás. Y cuando digo que tenemos que mostrar solidaridad con los del Este, yo he planteado en una conversación particular esta mañana pues una pregunta, porque claro, nosotros la pregunta que queremos que nos digan es que si nos ocurre algo en el estrecho, que hemos dicho Marruecos púdicamente esta mañana, he oído cuando he estado, dejémosla ser púdicos, Ceuta, Melilla. Nosotros, y lo saben muy bien los que están más involucrados en la defensa de España, pensamos que tenemos que estar en condiciones de enfocar eso nosotros solos. Pero bien nos gustaría que los demás nos ayudaran. ¿Nos van a ayudar a los demás? Esto es algo que también quizás nuestros gobiernos, este o el que sea, debieran de empezar a explorar, de decir, oiga usted, sí, yo voy a ir hasta ese 5%, con buena o mala gana, y ya veremos, y esto y lo otro. Pero, ¿y ustedes por mí qué harán un día? Si ocurre. Yo creo que no va a ocurrir, pero hay que ver en estas cosas. En fin, Encarna, no quiero alargarme más y quizás hay que dejarlo al debate, pero yo pienso que el peso está en los europeos.
Muchísimas gracias, Carlos. Y vamos a seguir. Se me estaba olvidando que era la moderadora porque yo os dejaría seguir y seguir. Pero, bueno, gracias por la intervención, por esta píldora de cultura de la defensa que enlaza con lo que comentábamos esta mañana. Rafa Martínez decía, en España falta cultura de la defensa porque luego las encuestas salen como salen y ese 33% que aparentemente se quedaría tan tranquilamente si España sufriera un ataque exterior. Bueno, pues esta píldora de cultura de la defensa está muy bien. Creo que por alusiones, antes de abrir el debate, vamos a hacer un turno de alusiones, porque Carlos, yo me quedo con tu invocación a que no lloremos. Ese es un buen lema para la construcción de esta etapa. Tras este mundo de ayer, bueno, viene esa nueva etapa, que no nos coja llorando, y creo que la cuestión que te plantea Pascal, y yo la uniría también, y me cuelo también en la pregunta, con la situación europea de percepción de falta de un liderazgo europeo en cada país y en Europa en general.
So the question that Carlos has stated is extended nuclear deterrence. East France is playing a role in extended nuclear deterrence to the profit of other European countries. It was taken for granted that US umbrella is playing a role to protect European countries, but I think that now, between Putin and Trump, nobody's believe in this US nuclear extended deterrence. East France could play this role. I think that there is many things. First, the decision could be only taken by one man. It could not be a collective decision, because collective decision is no decision. So it's French weapons, so the only man who could take the decision is the French president. If tomorrow, after tomorrow, we have a European Federation, the president of the UN Federation will take this role. But for the time being, it's only the English Prime Minister and the French President who could play this role. In 1974, in NATO summit, I think in Canada, I can't remember exactly, but in NATO summit, Nixon was in power. It was after the adoption by NATO of graduate response. NATO has stated that UK and French nuclear weapons are playing a useful role for European defense. Because before, US were opposed to the French nuclear deterrence, saying that it could make some difficulties, and after there is a reconciliation. So even NATO recognized that the UK and French nuclear weapons could play a positive role for European defense. In the white paper, French white paper, Think 72, the French nuclear weapons has two main roles. The first is to protect French territory. It's to sanctuarization of the French territories. The second is to protect vital French interests. And in my mind, vital French interests are related to European Union, because we are part, it's our security, it's our economy, it's our culture, we are part of, and we have the citizenships and so on. I think that there is a role which is playing by French nuclear weapons to extend protection to, and that French vital interest and European vital interests are intertwined. But I think we could not say in advance who is protected and who is not, because it will give information to the would-be enemy. And do we need to have money from other European countries to pay the bill? I don't think so. First, because I think that European taxpayer won't be agreed to pay French nuclear weapons, and it will create more problems than to bring solution. And plus the fact that the French fear it's a deterrent from the weak to the strong, since the beginning. We don't need to have the same level of Soviet and after Russian nuclear weapons to deter Soviet or to deter Russian. And remember, Carlos, when we were discussing Euromarcel, it was could we integrate French nuclear weapons in the total of Western nuclear weapons regarding the balance of force between Moscow and Washington? But in fact, since the beginning, we don't need, because what is the difference between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons? If you want to deter a conventional attack, you have to have more or less the same level of weapon. But with only one nuclear weapon, you could deter the enemy. Because it's not that you have to be sure to reach it, but he could fear that you could reach him. So we don't need having more nuclear weapons, because there is it's in fact the nuclear liberate from the law of the number. We don't need to have the same level of nuclear weapons to deter other nuclear countries. It's an advantage.
I think this is going to be a very big question if we do indeed move down the road of greater European integration in military preparations as part of becoming more autonomous from the US. So I think we're going to be discussing this for a while, and from various different perspectives. So first thing to say is, don't equate French and British nuclear forces. French nuclear force is independent. The British nuclear force is not. Britain is reliant for its technology upon the USA. And I think that all sorts of questions have long been raised about how much operational independence there actually would be. How independently would the Prime Minister be able to act if needing to take a decision, even to threaten to use nuclear weapons? Were a Prime Minister to say, if you do that, the nuclear option is on the table, is it not likely that an American politician says, no, it's not? So don't equate British and French nuclear forces. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this question of the umbrella, the US nuclear umbrella, or indeed a French nuclear umbrella, there are long-term dilemmas and uncertainties about that, which are summed up in the question of, would the US president sacrifice Washington to save London or Paris or Madrid or Toledo? You know, would he? Would she? Would a US president be willing to do that? And if not, then the doubt is at multiple levels. And you're right that certainty, the risks are so high, the impact, if even one nuclear weapon is used, is so high that, of course, you don't have to be certain that the weapon will be used. But if uncertainty is being multiplied at all sorts of different levels, that has long been the justification in Europe for having a French nuclear force and what in British terminology was called a second centre of decision-making. Right. I think an additional point to add, you made it, Pascal, so I just refer to it, but just to underline it. More nuclear weapons do not equate to more deterrent effect. The mathematical relationship is very, very different. And indeed, one problem, of course, is that more nuclear weapons can relate to less deterrent effect, depending on what happens, what the adversary does. And this is one of the problems when we talk about deterrence. Because where does deterrence happen? We set out to achieve a deterrent effect. Where does that effect happen? It's not in our heads. Right? It happens in the adversary's head. This is psychological. One is trying to influence the calculations and the thinking of the adversary, who has their own rationale, who has their own risk assessment that may be very different from ours. It may be culturally very different. What were we hearing this morning? That Russian people have been raised on a different view about war than Western Europeans have. I'm not sure how true that is, but if it is true, then it means that the basis of those calculations is very different. And then the last point I would make is that there is a complication here which probably only is seen by the real enthusiasts for this argument, or for these issues, which is that French nuclear doctrine and NATO's main nuclear doctrine and concepts, or rather, let me say this, the concepts of deterrence are different in NATO and in France when it comes to nuclear weapons. In France, in French discourse, when you talk about deterrence, you very often move straight to nuclear weapons. That is where deterrence lies. And there is a thing which you can see with that as well. If you look in the media throughout Europe, there will be a shift quickly to be talking about deterrence means nuclear deterrence. But for NATO, and in NATO doctrine, deterrence, first of all, means conventional deterrence. I mean, if you could rely on nuclear deterrence, why would you bother with conventional forces? Right? You don't have deterrence unless you have conventional forces to a level of adequacy, and then there's an argument about nuclear deterrence. Speaking personally, I put almost all the emphasis on conventional deterrence. I think nuclear weapons are a complication, an abomination. I hate them, I loathe them, I'm frightened of them, and I would rather leave them out of the equation. I realize this is a very psychological and emotional reaction. But for me, deterrence is about conventional forces, and not just about their scale, but about their doctrines, their utility, about how they're deployed, and so on. That is, strangely, for me, that is closer to the NATO doctrine about deterrence, with the emphasis on conventional forces, which is the justification for the 5% today. I mean, if you didn't have an emphasis on conventional deterrence, you would not be thinking about 5%. Right? So there are many factors in there. This is a complex and very important debate.
Cierra, si quieres, esta ronda y abrimos a las preguntas de los asistentes.
No, yo estoy de acuerdo con Dan, con lo que acaba de decir. Yo no he mencionado la disuasión nuclear británica, cuando he hablado de una disuasión nuclear europea de una federación. Por eso, pero además me parece bien haber provocado un poco estos comentarios, porque es verdad que la arma nuclear que dispone el Reino Unido está más ligada a Estados Unidos, mientras que la francesa es independiente. Estoy muy de acuerdo en lo que dice esa distinción entre, no sé si Pascal está de acuerdo, pero yo sí entiendo que en la OTAN hay un énfasis en la disuasión convencional, previamente a la nuclear. La francesa, no sé, claro, si es solo la francesa, lógicamente van hacia la nuclear, porque sus fuerzas armadas no estarían en condiciones, en principio, de evitar ellas solas una invasión. Pongamos Rusia, ya hemos visto que Rusia no es tanto, pero en fin, la que pensábamos. Pero claro, en el marco otánico, que Francia también está, pues evidentemente hay que ir por la parte convencional primero. Eso es el último recurso, el de la disuasión nuclear. Hay algo que me ha interesado en el conflicto en Ucrania. Ha sido el manejo por parte de Putin y sus generales de su propia disuasión nuclear. Nos ha amenazado con ella todo el tiempo, sobre todo al principio, ahora menos. Y sin embargo, poco a poco sus líneas rojas han ido retrocediendo, porque incluso los ucranianos han invadido territorio propiamente ruso y no lo han usado. Lo cual pone en evidencia que, aunque sea uno Putin, lo de emplear por primera vez un ingenio nuclear, como diría en francés, c'est compliqué, es muy complicado. Y tomar esa decisión no es fácil, no es fácil. Es un pequeño aspecto esperanzador, lo digo por el medio. Pero, en fin, me alegro que hayamos este debate y me ha parecido muy interesante lo que han dicho.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Abrimos, allí hay vale, pues el micro que ya está en poder del primer preguntador y luego seguimos.
Bueno, soy Fran Sevilla, de nuevo. He llegado un poco tarde al debate porque por razones profesionales he estado escuchando en directo la comparecencia de Donald Trump, ¿no? Que es muy significativo muchas de las cosas que ha dicho, y supongo que a la audiencia, que lo leerán después o alguno habrán mirado ahora en redes, les voy a comentar lo que ha dicho para luego exponer algún tema. Sobre España, literalmente, España es terrible lo que han hecho. Es el único país que no pagará al completo. Y amenazado con represalias comerciales, ha dicho que España pagará el doble. No voy a permitirlo, tendrán que desembolsarlo en el comercio, y anuncia que va a adoptar represalias comerciales contra España, supuestamente, ¿no? Sobre lo que es la cumbre en sí, ha dicho que ha sido un absoluto éxito, que hay un incremento histórico de ese 5%, no en información u otras capacidades, sino en material real, armamento, que producirá mayoritariamente la industria estadounidense. Aquí pongo un paréntesis. De nuevo, creo que el plan no es que Europa pueda alcanzar una autonomía en defensa, sino beneficiar al socio más potente de la alianza, ¿no? Y que ese incremento de gasto tendrá que seguir en los próximos años, más allá del 5%. Sobre Irán e Israel, que están cansados de la guerra, que el conflicto en cualquier caso podría reiniciarse. Dice que ha sido un éxito el bombardeo, cita un supuesto informe israelí según el cual las instalaciones de Fordo han quedado completamente inoperativas. Ha comparado el bombardeo con el de Hiroshima y de Nagasaki y ha dicho que ha puesto fin a una guerra terrible como aquella de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. No sé si esto es una hipérbole o una doble hipérbole. Por supuesto, ha atacado a los medios de comunicación, concretamente a la CNN y a The New York Times, porque con informes de la Agencia Internacional de Energía Atómica han cuestionado el resultado del bombardeo sobre Irán. Dice que volverá a hablar con Irán la próxima semana para insistir en que no sigan con su programa nuclear. Con relación a Ucrania, que hablará pronto con Putin, que verá la posibilidad de poner fin a la guerra, que no se ha reunido con Zelensky, dice que no se ha discutido un alto el fuego en la reunión con Zelensky, y Zelensky, en una rueda de prensa paralela, ha dicho que sí se ha discutido un alto el fuego, con lo cual...
Oye, perdona, te voy a dar las gracias por el resumen, pero igual te pido, porque si no, entiendo que les vas a pedir su reacción, sí, y igual se nos pierde.
La última.
Vale.
Rute, esto es lo que ha dicho Rute en rueda de prensa, entre otras cosas. No cree que su halago a Trump, expuesto por el propio presidente de Estados Unidos en las redes, le perjudique como secretario general de la OTAN. Ya saben ustedes cuál ha sido el comentario absolutamente, no sé si calificarlo de servil, de Rutte. Empezaría quizás por el embajador, como considera el que puede afectar lo de Rutte a su Secretaría General de la Alianza, y cómo ven ellos, los panelistas, el panorama que se abre ahora, si realmente esto va a servir para que se refuerce la Alianza Atlántica o básicamente se va a reforzar Estados Unidos.
Gracias. De la OTAN a Rutte, a la filtración de los emails aduladores de Rutte a
Pero
Trump.
yo no me dedico al gossip, como dicen en inglés, yo al cotilleo me trae cuidado. A mí lo que me parece importante es que el señor Trump ha firmado el comunicado de la OTAN. Lo que diga luego, pues bien, sí, son los problemas que plantea el señor Trump y tendremos que navegar con ellos, claro. Pero ¿qué le vamos a hacer? Es que es el que nos han colocado ahí. Yo no le he votado. Ninguno de los que estamos aquí me parece que le ha votado. Y si fuéramos americanos, pues no sé, yo no le hubiera votado, pero en algunas cosas le doy la razón. Ojo, que Trump no es equivocado en todo, ¿no? Entonces, a mí, comentar yo la tengo que ver para poder comentar, más. A mí me interesa más que creo que oficialmente se ha confirmado el hecho de que Estados Unidos y los demás han firmado todos este comunicado. Es interesante su reacción con lo de Sánchez. Bueno, yo no quiero entrar en política interior en este momento, pero yo creo que Sánchez ha firmado el 5%. No sé por qué Trump dice que no. Sánchez le habrá dicho que no lo va a cumplir. Bueno, bien. Rajoy tampoco cumplió, ojo. Y aquí pues ya veremos qué pasa de aquí a 10 años. Ahora, claro, si desde el principio dices no voy a cumplir, no voy a cumplir, no voy a cumplir, pues tendremos otros problemas. En fin, eso me parece evidente.
Gracias. ¿Vuestra valoración de este resumen de la cumbre?
We have put the dust under the carpet because, in fact, there is no agreement. And no European countries have the tools to pay 5% of their GDP in defense. No one. And even US had only, they will add to 1 trillion next year, but that's only 3.9% of their GDP. So even US is not reaching the goal. So we are, it's a comedy. But on the other hand, I think that Rutte is very shameful, because he is a new Chamberlain, he is making appeasement to Trump, but it's no sense, because once again, the more you try to please Trump, the more he thinks you are weak and he has to put more pressure on you. The only way Trump respects only force, not weakness. He has no friends. And so he respects China because China is strong against him. And we have to do the same. Otherwise, we'll be swallowed.
Gracias.
Yes, I agree with that. I think, though, I would disagree about this question of the 5%. I don't think first of all, I disagree with it as a policy target. But do I think it is impossible to be achieving that over the next 10 years or getting close to it? I mentioned this morning that world military spending is at a record level, 2.7 trillion US dollars. It has never been so high. That equates to about 2.5% of world economic output in 2024. 40 years before that, in 1984, according to World Bank figures working off CIPRI data, the world spent 4.2% of its economic output on the military. And 20 years before that, in 1964, the world spent 5.4% of its economic output on military spending. So I think it would be, first of all, I think it would be wrong to think that we have reached peak military spending. That figure of 2.7 trillion is going to go up. All the indicators show that. Secondly, I think it can continue to go up for quite a while. but there are very tough decisions to be taken in there. I mean, you can basically finance that increase in military spending, maybe not the whole way to 5%, but certainly well above present levels. You can finance it, I think, in one of three ways. You can take the money from the rich through taxation, you can take the money from the poor by reducing social services, or you can take the money from the future with loans. Those are the three things I think that you can do, right? And Europe has a set of decisions to make about that. So this discussion about defense and what Europe does, I mean, this is an enormous thing. Where on the one hand, one should be thinking about the nuclear dimensions we were just talking about. On the other hand, we need to go and think about the broader human security, ecological security dimensions. We need to be thinking about what kind of society we want to be defending, because we will be shaping that through the choice, in part, through the choices which are made about military. This is why this is such an important moment in world, well, certainly in European history, but I agree with you in world history as well. The world order is not going to look the same in 5 to 10 years' time as it does now or the previous 80 years.
Muchas gracias. Hay una pregunta aquí, luego iremos para allá. Aquí en el... Gracias.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Sí, sí.
Una pregunta en general a la mesa, una pregunta un poco ingenua, desde un caballero particular en este momento. Comparando un poco, en vez de una situación militar, político-militar, si habláramos de dinero, si habláramos de fusiones, de adquisiciones, suponiendo que la OTAN fuera un conglomerado industrial, en que hubiera que valorar todos los movimientos, ¿conocen ustedes algún estudio que realmente haya descendido al terreno y haya valorado lo que pone cada uno realmente? Evidentemente Estados Unidos desplaza, sobre todo en el pasado, multitud de hombres, multitud de medios, pero ¿para qué les sirve? ¿Qué ponemos nosotros? ¿Qué medios ponemos nosotros, los europeos? Bueno, quien dice europeos dice Corea, que dice Japón, para que los intereses americanos puedan extenderse realmente. Y por otra parte, ¿qué le compramos? Pues F-15, F-18, los sistemas Aegis de nuestras fragatas, el corazón de nuestros nuevos submarinos S-80, que algún día llegarán a ser efectivos, etcétera, etcétera. Y finalmente, cuando yo me fusiono con una empresa, cuando llegamos a un consejo, aunque aquel diga que ha puesto mucho dinero, yo le digo sí, pero has hecho subir el precio del petróleo porque has destruido los medios de producción de Libia, de Siria, de Irak y de medio mundo, ¿no? Y por otra parte le puedo decir, bueno, sí, pero tú has fracasado y has bajado todo el prestigio de la compañía porque has abandonado Afganistán, has salido de mal en peor en Irak, has destruido países. Entonces, el valor de mis acciones, ¿cuánto valen? Tú dices que has puesto tal dinero, pero yo te estoy comprando, yo te estoy pagando. Yo estoy poniendo mis compañías a tu servicio para que te extiendas por el mundo. Yo estoy poniendo la base de Morón para que desde ahí saltes sin que yo lo sepa, o sea, sin contarme nada, saltas con tu infantería de marina, con los Osprey, a dar palos en medio de África, ¿no? Me estás poniendo en riesgo porque a mí me pueden bombardear o la base de Morón o la base de Rota o la infraestructura que tengo que está recibiendo petróleo ruso en Bilbao o en Ferrol, ¿no? Entonces, ¿hay algún libro, bueno, algún estudio que realmente haya estudiado la aportación económica real de Estados Unidos respecto a los otros socios? Me refiero en general sobre los europeos, pero puede ser en general, ¿no? Yo soy muy escéptico, partiendo de una base realista, de cuál es ese desequilibrio, ¿no? Yo no sé si aporta tanto a Estados Unidos o nos cuesta tanto. Gracias.
No me puedo atrever, pero yo no soy economista. O sea que no le puedo contestar desde esa perspectiva. Voy a ir un paso más lejos. El Estado funciona con intangibles. ¿Cómo vaya a valorar la seguridad? ¿Alguien economista me puede decir cuánto vale la seguridad de España frente a la seguridad que tiene Italia? Son intangibles. hay cosas que son muy difíciles de medir. Por ejemplo, durante la Guerra Fría, hay quien argumentaba, yo no quiero armamento nuclear en mi país porque voy a ser un objetivo del posible enemigo. Pero es que ese argumento también se puede darle la vuelta. Quizás por no tener armamento nuclear uno es más objetivo de un primer lanzamiento del otro, porque como ha dicho Dan, lo que está en la cabeza de los demás se puede intuir, pero no estamos tan seguros. Yo creo que, en fin, se pueden hacer valoraciones económicas de cuánto contribuye Estados Unidos o Europa a la defensa de Europa, y se han hecho, yo no los tengo, pero grosso modo, yo lo que ahora estoy jubilado, pero oí hace 10, 15 años, era que Estados Unidos ponía el 75%. Pero hay otras formas de calcularlo, evidentemente. Luego está lo que se ha aludido, las compras, porque eso está fuera de eso. Claro, Estados Unidos tiene una industria de armamento muy fuerte y muy buena. Bueno, pues Europa tendrá que hacer más esfuerzo, pero cuesta dinero hacer una industria de defensa. Supongo, yo no soy economista, pero supongo que habrá que valorar cuánto invierto en tener una industria mía propia, o si me sale quizás más barato algunas cosas comprarlas a Estados Unidos, porque están ya hechas y porque son muy buenas, ¿no? Todos esos son cálculos muy difíciles, pero lo que yo quiero hacer, sobre todo subrayar, es que los cálculos de los estados tienen muchas veces intangibles. No se puede decir si vale más o si vale menos. Es una percepción. La disuasión es una percepción. Hace falta que el de enfrente piense que no le trae cuenta atacarme. Y eso es una percepción.
¿Queréis añadir algo? ¿Queréis añadir algo? Si no, hay otra, pasamos a otra pregunta.
Just very quickly to say, seen from the American side, the US takes 43% of the world arms transfers market. Its share of the export market in full-scale weapon systems is 43% for just the one supplier. So that might be something concrete by which, from the American side, you measure benefit. The second thing is, and it picks up on what you were saying about the intangibles, one thing to remember about Trump is that he really doesn't understand that sort of thing. He understands relationship, one-to-one, and transaction. He doesn't understand intangibles. Do you remember the time when Rex Tillerson, I won't say the full quote in this company with so many prestigious people here, but he remarked that President Trump was a moron. There had been a high-level meeting, Trump left the room, Tillerson looked around the room and he said to the other people who were there, the president is a moron. What they had just been discussing was alliance. What they had just been discussing was US benefit and gains from alliances. And Trump had said, I just don't get it, and had left the room. And this is very reliably reported. So the intangibles are absolutely crucial to this whole discussion and completely go over the head of one of the most important participants in it.
Gracias. Hay una pregunta allí al fondo. Ahí está. Y perdón, ¿hay más? ¿Tengo que tener más preguntas controladas? Allí, Miguel Ángel Aguilar, para continuar, porque, bueno, vamos bien, ¿no? Miguel Ángel, vamos estupendamente. Vale, gracias.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Joel, soy jurista y analista de asuntos internacionales y voy a intentar hacer pequeñas preguntas para los tres del panel. Empiezo para el embajador Carlos Miranda. A raíz de los resultados de esta cumbre que hemos visto, estos desacuerdos, ha sido más la cumbre del 5% y sobre todo de los rifirrafes y las declaraciones. ¿Usted cree que España políticamente sale bien parada de este encuentro, de este choque con Trump? O más bien, esto puede ser una oportunidad también para nuestro país, para presentarnos como liderar un bloque de oposición a ese impuesto 5% que nos quieren imponer desde el otro lado del Atlántico y más bien mostrar una posición más fuerte como miembro desde Europa. I would like to continue in English. So you talk about many interesting things about the position from Britain. when you talk about the nuclear force, no, that we know that is in the origins, the Skyball issue, no, in the 60s. But I would like to come back right now to the current times. Do you think that, given the results of the summit, what would be now the position of the UK? They will align with the US, or Steinmeier can be closer to their European partners to make a European more European front? And what would be the position of the Nordic states in this situation? They will be more pro-Atlantic, more pro-European. Monsieur Pascal, merci beaucoup. Je suis ravi de vous voir nouveau dans cette forum. Je voudrais vous poser la question, est-ce que vous vous souvenez qu'en 2018, la France a voulu de liderer une initiative très intéressante, non? Une initiative européenne. Est-ce que à cause de la déclaration de Macron qu'il veut vraiment d'achever les 300% d'expenditure militaire, est-ce que vous pensez que c'est le moment pour la France de liderer une initiative européenne de réarmement de la défense, ou plutôt c'est de revenir plus proche de l'allié américain? Gracias a todos.
Yo creo que España no sale bien parada, eso es primero. Uno de los intangibles, ya que hablamos de eso, de la OTAN es la unidad. Liderar la desunidad en la OTAN es un error. Hay formas de oponerse, de matizar, de discutir, son otras, pero todo lo que sea dar una imagen de falta de unidad de la OTAN es un grave error.
So I think that, first of all, Keir Starmer's instinct will be to continue to form a bridge. There is a belief in Britain that is not held to an equal extent in the USA, that we in Britain have a certain degree of closeness and therefore influence with the US. And you could see this, for example, in the way that Tony Blair quite obviously went along with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 in the crisis after the Twin Towers, in part in the view that by riding on America's coattails, he could slow Bush down and steer him a bit. And I think history has proven that this British image of ourselves has really very limited grounding in reality. But it is true that quite often the UK has been able, while it was in the EU, and perhaps even more now, to play this bridge between the majority of the European governments and the US. The difficulty, if you're trying to be the bridge, right, is it's like, I don't know if anybody's ever tried to, standing on the dockside, trying to hold a boat while the current is steadily pulling the boat away from you. You know, if the two sides are moving away from each other, you become stretched more and more thinly as you try to be the bridge. But I think it's the British instinct will be not to make a choice. That's what British diplomacy will be aimed at, for a while at least. And you could see this straight after the Brexit referendum, as immediately Theresa May, who became the Prime Minister then, started talking about a special security arrangement with Europe. And she talked about it so enthusiastically that at the Munich Security Conference she was asked openly and in public, well then why did you leave the EU? Right? So I think this security bridge, that will be the UK's aim. For the Nordic states, they will welcome it. In a way, Finland, Sweden and Denmark as well are kind of in a process of integration into NATO. It's obvious that it would be the case with Finland and Sweden, but Denmark also, because in Danish policy thinking, they have held themselves so far back and away from the NATO mainstream, and now they are reconnecting to it. Norway has a calmer relationship to it, but they will all welcome this kind of different possibility They don't want to get into the position where Sanchez is or where France traditionally is. They seek a different position, and the UK gives them the opportunity to have that different position.
It could be the French moment, by the fact, because France has repeatedly pleaded for European autonomy, and now it's, in fact, the US president said that there is no more Western wall, so we have to do something. But in my view, Macron is a little bit shy on this, and he tries to keep a link with Trump and not to jump over the situation. And in fact, Spain has, on many fields, Spain has taken the traditional role of France in diplomacy regarding Middle East, because Spain is more active on Middle East than France now, because Macron wants to keep a link on Netanyahu. It's perfectly without any importance, because Netanyahu is not hearing that Macron has no influence over Netanyahu. And Macron tries to keep a unity between the UK Prime Minister with the German Chancellor. And so in the same period of time, I'm sure that Mitterrand, Chirac, and de Gaulle will have been more active. And Macron, which was we want to fly solo at the beginning, now want to play collective, and he is less active than in the first years of his presidency, perhaps because he has been diminished on the internal political field, because he has a lot of difficulties, he has no meetings in front of him, but I think that unfortunately he is not taking the role he could have taken in other times.
Gracias.
Sí, por una parte, todo este asunto de la disuasión nuclear, yo creo que es un asunto al que le deberían la Unión Europea y Francia darle una vuelta, porque sería muy inteligente sumarse a eso que definió el general Boffre como la disuasión del débil al fuerte. O sea, el débil, pero capaz de causar un daño inaceptable al fuerte, y que con eso, solamente con eso le disuade. Yo creo que eso sería muy importante. Luego está sobre el final de la cumbre, pues que hay un comunicado, hay no sé qué, pero lo que hay, se parte todo de una cifra que nadie ha explicado, por qué el 5, en qué consiste, no sabemos nada de cuáles son las capacidades militares de las que se quiere dotar la OTAN, y tampoco ha habido en la posición española una explicación clara de cuál es la aportación que, más allá del 5 o del 2%, España, las Fuerzas Armadas españolas están haciendo en las misiones OTAN en muchos sitios. Y entonces, pues yo creo que ¿cómo queda España en este asunto? Pues queda, como casi siempre, confuso. Hay alguna cosa que se ha dicho por parte del presidente, pero el presidente, ¿a quién está hablando cuando dice que no va a cumplir el 5%? ¿A quién se dirige? ¿A quién le manda ese mensaje? ¿Con quién quiere forjar alianzas en España cuando toma esa posición internacional? ¿Y cuándo o cómo va a afrontar el problema en el interior de su propio gobierno con cualquiera de las decisiones que tome sobre la OTAN?
So I would just comment on the question you raised about the 5%. It's arbitrary. It's a good-sounding figure. You can break it down then to 3.5% will be they call it the core military spending, and 1.5% for other. It's also convenient. It looks good. 3.5% is more than 3 that some states were talking about. That's more than 2, which NATO was committed to. I think this is all needs to be understood in rather shallow political terms. Now, this is not to say that in the end it would be wrong to spend a certain, whether it was 5% or 3.5%. It's just that that kind of figure does not come out of a process where you have thought about what the forces need to face what scenarios across a 10 to 50 year period ahead, because some of the weaponry which is being developed now will still be in service in 50 years' time. Right? Military equipment has an extraordinarily long life. So it hasn't come out of that process. It's come out of a political process, and most of that politics has been about theatre and statement and counter-statement and outbidding each other. The other thing to say about this is that this is all to do with measures of input. It's not to do with measures of output. That's why part of what is important is to talk not about how much, but about how. How is it going to be spent? Because only by looking through how it's going to be spent will you come to what the output is at the end, the deliverable in terms of military forces, which then, if deployed in a suitable way, should be providing you with more of this intangible, the sense of security. But when you're talking about a GDP figure, you're talking about the input, and you're talking about an arbitrary figure. And of course, the other thing is that as GDP goes up and down, the real meaning of the percentage changes in any case. So.
¿Algo que añadir, embajador? Pascal, ¿queréis añadir? No, pues tú sí.
Muy brevemente, para coger lo que dice Dan de cómo se gasta. Yo le hice la pregunta a un muy alto mando de nuestras Fuerzas Armadas en enero y le dije si mañana te dan el 3%, ¿en qué te lo gastas? Y la respuesta fue muy lógica. No me lo puedo gastar. No tengo en qué gastármelo. No tengo la suficiente gente. No tengo esto. Puedo gastar más, pero no puedo de pronto gastar demasiado. Con lo cual, pues es evidente que este 5%, que es arbitrario, hay que gestionarlo a lo largo de los 10 años y no empezar diciendo no voy a cumplirlo.
Muchas gracias. Ah, perdón, ¿has acabado?
No, sí, he acabado.
No. A Diego Carcedo, si no hay más palabras, os pediré a los ponentes que hagáis una respuesta a Diego y también, si queréis, hacer un minuto de oro de todo lo que ha sido esta ponencia tan interesante y cerraríamos esta ponencia. Gracias.
Gracias. A mí me sorprende un poco, bueno, las diferencias que hay entre todos ustedes, que me parecen enormemente muy interesantes, pero evidentemente estas discrepancias también existen en todo el ámbito europeo. Tenemos el ejemplo de España, donde evidentemente las posiciones del presidente del gobierno español en esta cumbre de La Haya pues son muy diferentes de las que una parte de la sociedad española muy numerosa pues también las mantiene. Entonces me resulta muy sorprendente que una decisión de esta naturaleza, aunque ya hace tiempo que se viene hablando de ella, que esta decisión que ha estado además dos saltos entre el 2%, el 2,1%, el 3,5%, el 5%, bueno, de 32 países, es que me resulta un poco sorprendente que pueda tomarse en una reunión de 2 horas y media, bajo la férula siempre de un presidente norteamericano, que bueno, es muy importante, indudablemente, pero bueno, que también ofrece unas características muy especiales y que pueda tomarse esa decisión por parte en 2 horas y media partiendo de un elogio desmesurado, vergonzante del secretario general de la OTAN al presidente de los Estados Unidos, que al fin y al cabo pues es un miembro más, aunque sea el más poderoso de la OTAN, si esto puede ser tomado en serio o esa división puede ser un pésimo ejemplo para las diferentes sociedades de los diferentes países implicados en este asunto, que no me parece que es una forma muy adecuada para que se pueda llegar a un consenso de esta naturaleza en el ámbito de todos los países afectados.
Gracias, y os doy la palabra a los tres con ese minuto y resultado.
Yo simplemente te diré, Diego, que esto no se ha discutido durante 2 horas y media, esto llevan discutiéndolo meses. O sea que esto es el momento en el que todo está acordado y ya está, y se aprueba. Yo he visto muchas reuniones de OTAN a diferentes niveles y, bueno, las peleas están antes. A veces las cosas han llegado a los jefes de Estado. Yo he visto una vez a Fernández Ordóñez teniendo que pelearse con otros ministros un comunicado porque había alguien que no tal, pero eso generalmente se viene trabajando con mucho tiempo por delante. Yo creo que este objetivo, y quiero dejar de lado el tema de si es un servil o no, el señor Rutte, que ha sido un primer ministro holandés importante, yo creo que aquí el asunto es mantener a Estados Unidos aquí. Y eso requería, por un lado, sin duda alguna, el halago. Yo no hablo del telegrama ese, hablo en términos generales, decirle, hay que hablar con él, hay que convencerle. Y una de las cosas que quería, pues era esto, el 5%. Pero yo me parece estupendo decirle, oye, macho, que yo no voy a seguirte la pista. Pero yo lo que he visto que Alemania, Francia, Italia lo hacen de otra manera. Y es como a mí me gustaría que se hiciera.
Muchas gracias.
First of all, I completely agree. The summit is not the place where the issues are discussed in detail. The summit is the place where the choreography is done and out comes the communique, which has been prepared long in advance. However, I still stand by saying that the 5% is an arbitrary figure which has not been produced through a bottom-up research or analysis of what forces need, and that this all adds up to 5%. In addition, I think that from an early stage in this preparatory process, that certainly the British, and I think also Macron, I think Germany would go along with this and the rest would go along with those three, have been looking to make sure that they avoid a disaster. You know, I was in Munich when J.D. Vance made that speech at the Munich Security Conference, and I saw the look on the faces of senior officials coming out, one of whom said that, you know, Putin, with his most elaborate hybrid warfare, could not have had this effect. And then J.D. Vance goes off from the Munich Security Conference. He doesn't talk to Chancellor Scholz, who was still the Chancellor at that time. He goes to meet the leader of the AfD, the right-wing extremist party. And other things were being said at that time, which then brings you into this moment where, was it Ursula von der Leyen said, you know, or was the High Representative, I forget which, said the Western world needs a new leader. So there's a turmoil going on in February and March with the first impact of the topic of this panel, in fact, the disruptive effect of Trump. And I think that the diplomatic aim has been to simply avoid a disaster, avoid something where Trump storms out, starts launching more broadsides and attacks. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk Spain down, but, you know, just attacking Spain, that's a small thing. Attacking the entire Western European security elite, if he had done that, that would have been really serious. So they've kept it calm, they've kept it manageable, they've kept everything down. But I also agree with you, sir. I mean, I think that this is a really odd-looking event in which I don't see European leaders actually behaving like leaders. I think that diplomats are behaving quite effectively, right? But I don't see the leaders behaving like leaders at a time when I think there is a real appetite in European publics to find some leadership. And that's why when I made my main remarks, I concluded by saying, you know, stop being the rabbit in the headlights. We need to have a sense of what is the objective, what do we want to be doing. Presumably we want to be securing the future of Europe. The strategic objective is not have a good relationship with the US. A good relationship with the US is potentially important for helping secure the future of Europe. But if the US does not want the kind of relationship that seems to work towards that end, Europe also needs to think how to do that more autonomously. And then probably find yourself in a position where, because we're not bending over backwards to please somebody who can never be pleased, right, then actually he starts to treat us with a bit more respect, and we avoid these very odd-looking events like this 2.5-hour summit that has just been held.
Gracias.
Thank you. I think that this summit is quite of Potemkin village. Or it's a photo opportunity, but it's Potemkin village because the real problem are not being dealt. We are profoundly divided between Europeans and between Europeans and America. And we tend to be united, which is not the case. Hence, the irony is NATO has been created to keep Americans in, Soviets out, and Germans down. So for the time being, Americans are out, Russia are in, and Europeans are done. So we need to be up and not down, because for the time being, it's not the case. And in fact, we are in crisis. We are in a huge crisis because it's the end of a world. It's the end of the former world. Remember Gramsci. Old times are over, new times are not coming, so in the shadow surgissent les monstres. The monsters are coming. But on the other hand, for the Chinese, crisis is both risk and opportunities. So we have to cope the risk and to create opportunities.
Muchísimas gracias. Y gracias, damos por terminada esta cuarta sesión y les agradezco mucho la participación y la asistencia. Pido un aplauso para...